Hello, everyone. Come down to Decult if you can make it to Christchurch, and if you can't, buy the ticket for the live stream. Today, I'm volunteering for Decult, the Cult Awareness Conference happening in New Zealand, and we have author Craig Hoyle of the book Excommunicated. It's a powerful story about leaving a religious cult. We will be getting into it in a second here, but first I want to play a game with the audience. And here's a couple quotes from an article by Craig Hoyle about the group. So maybe you can guess which group it is. It's a community that offers members remarkable levels of warmth and mutual support, like cradle-to-grave socialism. Also, another quote, it's effed, it's twisted and manipulative and cruel. And one more, last one. To the horror of my family, I left for university shortly afterwards. I ate chips and curry for the first time. I openly read newspapers and novels. I drank wine. I wore quote-unquote normal clothes. I listened to pop music. I cut my hair. Being unclean was delicious. Craig, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Scott. Thanks for having me.
What group are we talking about? What did you grow up in?
I grew up in a group called the Exclusive Brethren, which now call themselves the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, but when I was in them, they were the Exclusive Brethren.
It's a group that I had never heard of until I left the cult my parents joined and grew up around the Jehovah's Witnesses. But once I got out, I started seeing people comment something. Oh, well, the Exclusive Brethren have something similar. And then that's how I became aware of it on Reddit or something. But where are they in the world? And where are you in the world?
So I'm based in New Zealand, in Auckland, which is the largest city here. The Exclusive Brethren started in the UK and Ireland about 200 years ago, and they spread from there. These days, they're mostly in white English-speaking countries, so the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand would make up more than 90% of their membership. And then there are smaller communities scattered through Europe and also through Caribbean and Argentina.
And how long has your family been involved with this group?
Since the very beginning. The earliest ancestors of mine to join the Exclusive Brethren joined in the 1820s, which was right when it started.
1820s. Wow.
About 200 years ago.
Wow.
So my great-great-great-great-grandparents on my mother's side, you can actually see in the pictures on the wall behind me, joined at the very beginning. They were friends with the founding members. And so it's something that my family has been involved with all the way through, and across 200 years of all of the various iterations of this group have impacted on my family in different ways.
So you're going to be speaking at the Decult conference in Christchurch this year, and you have your book. Can you describe your book and kind of what it's about and what you're excited about in terms of collaborating with Decult?
Absolutely. So as you said, my book, which I have here, is called Excommunicated, and it's a multi-generational story of leaving the Exclusive Brethren. And how it came about, when HarperCollins first asked me to write a book, I said that telling one person's story about leaving a group like this doesn't capture the full impact of it, because what happened to me was a product of what happened to my parents and what happened to their parents and what happened to their parents. And in my family, for instance, my grandpa got kicked out of the church in 1981, and his grandpa got kicked out of the church in 1920. And so there was this long history of people disagreeing with the church and then that having some quite severe consequences on their lives. And it was really important to me to weave that thread through and tell not just my story, but also my family's story with the Brethren over 200 years. And I think it's a really important point to make, especially at events like Decult, is that these religious groups don't happen in a vacuum. And you say, well, how would anyone end up in a position like that? And how would anyone go along with that? And in my family's case, there's 200 years of history and control and context. And so trying to unpick that and explain or try to explain how some of these things came about and then how they can be tackled. And the other really important thing for me with something like Decult is there are so many groups like this. And I found after coming out of the Exclusive Brethren, and I started talking to people who had come out of Gloriavale, which is a very reclusive Christian community here in New Zealand, and or the Jehovah's Witnesses, or even people who came out of the Mormon Church. And there are all of these similarities and all of these sort of shared languages and practices. And when you grow up in a group like this, you think that your group is unique and that you're the ones with the truth and you're the only ones who do this. And then you come out and realize there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of sort of weird little isolationist sects that are all doing the same thing. And so to be able to come together with people from some of those other groups and network and really share resources in terms of how to bring about awareness and help people leave those groups, I think is really important.
It's a great point, and it's something that I didn't quite realize until I got out of the Jehovah's Witnesses and started making a movie. I have a movie that's also playing at Decult called Witness Underground, and I have the podcast where I do interviews like this with authors and filmmakers and artists and musicians, that I started seeing all these other channels that were doing similar things. And there's so many, each group has like their own community of identifying as X. But then there's a few channels that bridge the gap and show the similarities. And I think that that's something that Anka Richter, the host of the Decult conference, did. She did in her book Cult Trip very well, with going to 4 different groups and showing the parallels and similar control structures. But this branching out and seeing, oh, there's similar parallel control. Let's talk about the control. But yeah, I really appreciate that point. And I think I'm excited about being associated with Decult for that reason. It's not just my story. Like, reading this article, there's an article about you in your book that I found, and there's so many parallels, and I want to get into some of those more detailed, nuanced things that are similar. There's some rules and structures. Can you, for someone who doesn't know anything about them, can you give just a real basic? I mean, you did already describe the history, but like, give me a couple rules and like this disconnection that you felt with your your grandparent and your father. Like, how extreme are these control structures?
Yeah, so probably the defining principle of the Exclusive Brethren is what they call their doctrine of separation. Um, and under the doctrine of separation, there's no social contact with outsiders. So you're born into the church. You these days go to a church school. You leave school. You go to work at a church business. You marry someone else from the church. So there's no social contact with outsiders. No social eating or drinking with outsiders. You can't have friends outside of the church. You can't have family outside the church, or more to the point, you can't have contact with family outside the church. And so it was very black and white. So you were either in or you were out. And if you were out, you were completely out. And so the impact that had is, for instance, my grandpa was thrown out in 1981 when my mother was 13. And what that meant was that he left the family house, or more accurately, was forced out, and from that point never saw his kids again. And we just got used to seeing this kind of thing happen. Like, one day people were there and the next they weren't. And that could happen to anyone you know at any time if the church took action against them. And so that, I think, is the most defining rule or doctrine. And then there are all sorts of other sort of lesser things that went along with that. So no TV, no radios, various other things that cycled through at different points. They didn't approve of Chinese food, for instance, at one point. And it was kind of hard to pick where some of these rules came from. Some of them were based in scripture, however tenuous that may have been. Some of them were just the personal reckons of the leaders at the time. And the other thing that got very, very sort of difficult to deal with was that the rules changed all the time. And so the previous world leader, so the world leader at the moment is the son of the previous world leader. The previous world leader was very clear about banning computers and mobile phones and things like that. And then his son has reintroduced all those things, and now they're okay again, but only if they're controlled by the church. And so trying to keep up with what's allowed and which of the rules still apply is very confusing, especially when you're young.
How often would you say there's like, are there little changes all the time, or is it like a big shift once in a while? And like, how often would you say like it turns over? Like the behavior control dial is changed.
It's little changes all the time, and I think, and with these things, it's not necessarily about change. It's about keeping people guessing, keeping them on their toes. So I remember we were told very clearly that we shouldn't be singing songs by Elton John, for instance, because Elton John was a gay degenerate. And but then I was out for dinner in Sydney in 2008 with the world leader who lives in Sydney, Bruce Hales. And this is a very church thing to do, you'd stand around the piano all belting out your gospel tunes and songs and whatever. And like, you're pissed out of your mind at this point, like, or you certainly can be. The world leader at this point was like 5 whiskies down. And when I say 5 whiskies, I mean like a tumbler with a bit of ice and then filled to the brim with neat scotch.
Okay.
So I'd
alcoholism is godliness.
There's a lot of heavy drinking in the Brethren. Okay. And so there'd been this massive alcohol consumption and everyone's merry and we're standing around the piano singing all these songs. And then someone suggested that we sing Candle in the Wind. And there was kind of this moment where we all looked at each other because we're like in the presence of the world leader who has banned singing Elton John songs. And then he's like, who in their right mind would suggest Candle in the Wind? And we're kind of all looking at each other and then looking at the world leader, waiting to see what he would do and how he would react. Because this is like, you're just straight up breaking the rules. And I thought he might suggest a different song or sort of gently admonish them or something. But no, he was all like, yes, let's sing that one. And away we went with Candle in the Wind. And it was just the most, like, the cognitive dissonance when I knew we weren't supposed to be singing Elton John. And he was the world leader himself belting some out. And so...
You just have to accept it as a member. Like, okay, I guess it's okay now to do that.
Yeah, and it's just the absolute, like the smallest thing. But then you'd go back to your home church and then maybe you'd sing a bit of Elton John and then you'd get in trouble again and then you'd say, well, I saw the world leader singing Elton John. But like, how do you, when there are all of these conflicting things happening, how do you know what's okay and what's not okay? And they used to talk all the time about following the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. But they were pretty good at applying the letter of the law when it suited them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many parallels. There was, in the 90s with the Jehovah's Witnesses, the internet was, I grew up with it. We adopted it at my age because I'm 43, so like old millennial, born in 81 or 81. But like the internet was just something that we used and we learned from and we got some information. We communicated there, and the religion was scared of it because they didn't understand it and they were older. And so they kind of said, like, you can't use the internet, and they kind of dismissed it all the time. Like, oh, you can't trust it. You can't trust it. There's no good information there. It's a scary, dangerous place. Don't use it. And then later it became kind of normalized, but then they're like, no social media, no Facebook, no MySpace. And then I was like, hey, there's a Jehovah's Witness website. People were like, there is not, that is apostate. And I was like, no, it's like a legitimate website that the religion has put out with their news and their articles and all the members were like, no, that's impossible. They would never. Like, you should be careful. And I'm like, I'm actively looking on the internet for information about my church. And then now they worship a URL and they point everybody to a website where they control the information. So there's always this shift. And I feel like with the bite model that Stephen Hassan came up with from the Moonies, another group, if you haven't heard of them, But the bite model is behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotion control. And after understanding those 4 ways of controlling, then it's like, oh, okay, they're just changing, they're just turning the dial. The rules are actually inconsequential. None of it really matters, but they're just keeping, like you said, keeping you on your toes. And it's fascinating because every group has some elements of that. Not every group, but these kinds of groups.
Yeah, and the Brethren are shifting on these things all the time. So I was still in the Brethren when they started rolling out access to computers and cell phones and so on, with the very important distinction that even now in the Brethren you can only have these devices and you can only access the internet if it's through the church.
Like they have their own apps.
Yes, they do. So you're not allowed, even these days, you're not allowed to own your own mobile phone. For instance, you have to hire a mobile phone from the central church trust.
Oh,
so the church owns the phone and has proprietary rights over the phone, and you have to pay a monthly rental back to the church, and the church can control what your phone can do and what apps you can access, what websites you can access. And I mean, this was never explicitly said, but my understanding when I was in the church was that at any point they could go in and search your devices if they suspected you of something.
Yeah, it's so authoritarian. This is the ultimate Big Brother move. Orwellian.
And you ask yourself that question: what's worse, not having access to the internet, or having access to the internet that's completely controlled by your church?
In that scenario, could you go out and buy a phone controlled by the rest of the world, a normal phone, and like access the internet? But then if you get caught, what happens?
So you could, and I did, and a lot of people still do. If they found out that you had a worldly phone, I suppose they would still call it.
It's the same language the Jehovah's Witnesses use, by the way.
Yeah.
And outsiders are called worldly, and it's like they're all bad, or they're all controlled by Satan or something.
Yes. You would possibly get a visit from the priests where they would try and either bargain with you or cajole or berate. The tactics that they use are different each time. It's definitely not allowed. But because there's no formal priestly structure, there's no formal rule book for dealing with these things, and so every case is sort of fly by night, see how we go. The priests there's no formal training, there's no accountability or review structure for making sure the right decisions have been made. And so often it really would just come down to what your local priests thought and said, and they might report it back to the world leader, and he might unofficially give them some advice. But they're very, very cautious now about getting the world leader publicly involved with these sorts of decisions, because from an accountability perspective, the safest thing is for him to be able to, at least publicly anyway, punt it back to the local church and say it's a local assembly decision and not his responsibility.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's risk if there's some court case where the leader's in charge. They put it on the small guy.
Yeah. And they don't like to have his fingerprints too near things. And I've seen contracts. So the current world leader is big on giving business advice now, but I've seen contracts that evidently some people have to sign now before meeting the world leader, where they agree that he can't be held personally liable for the impact of any advice he gives.
Wow.
Things like that.
Wow, okay.
And it's like, you're either, the Brethren say that he is the voice of God on earth, that he is Christ, is what they've said.
Whoa.
He can do no wrong. He's been sinless since the age of 12. All of these things, and it's like, okay, sure. If you're the voice of God on earth, then why do you need to get people to sign agreements saying that you can't be held liable for your advice. Like,
Yeah.
either you're God or you're not.
Right. Huh. Fascinating. It's interesting, the parallels, because like Jehovah's Witnesses don't have a charismatic cult leader anymore. They, after a bunch of problems, they went to a group of men, and now there's like a election. Well, there used to be elections, and now there's like an approval process. But then when there's a court case, they're like, no, that's not my responsibility. It's this other group made up by a group of other men, and it's like always like ambiguous who's in charge or who's culpable. Or
This was this was something that really bugged me when I was leaving the Brethren, and the priests kept wanting to see me, and I refused to talk to them, and one of the conditions for finally talking to them was I would not talk to them unless they agreed in writing that they were there as representatives of the church, not as individuals. Because I'd just seen this happen so many times that it's, oh, well, that was, that was an individual who went rogue. So no, it wasn't.
yeah. Well, I would love to dive in more, but we're here in support of Decult. And can you give us a little wrap up with what we're going to expect to hear from you on the Decult conference live, and also during the live stream, and also news about your book, Excommunicated?
Yeah, so first of all, on the book front, it came out in Australia and New Zealand in November. It's out in the UK now, and it's going to be out in North America shortly. So by the time Decult happens, it'll be available worldwide. In terms of speaking at Decult, I'm looking forward to talking about some of these things that we've just talked about, particularly the multi-generational aspect of some of these religious groups, and how we can help people. Because I think if you've joined a group, or if your parents have joined a group, it's one thing to come back out in society, but it's a whole other thing to come out into society when your family's been in there for 200 years.
Yeah. Born in one generation, but it's even more intense if it's multiple generations. Yeah.
Yeah. And exploring some of the ways that people can be helped from some of those groups. For instance, in New Zealand anyway, there's no official government recognition of what it's like having people come out of these groups. And really, I think there should be the same support structures in place as there are for refugees, because that's essentially what people who come out of cults are. They're religious refugees.
I have used this analogy many times to describe the situation that I have gone through. And I've seen refugees. I grew up in like a refugee area in my home state from the Vietnam War veterans and war victims who came in, Hmong and Laotian people from Vietnam. And so I grew up around it. And anyway, so that parallel is amazing, because there's this moment of, well, they don't want to be there. Their life got flipped upside down. But then some people, you see this shift happen where like, oh, this is an opportunity. Maybe it's out of desperation and trauma, but they're like, this is an incredible moment, actually. Let's embrace this new place. And they build a business, and then they have this opportunity, and they give their kids a good future that they may have never had before. And it's almost like we're choosing immigration, or it was ripped out from underneath us. And it's really comes down to a mind shift and getting past or working through some of the trauma. I think that's an incredible analogy. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I feel like I've never heard anyone say that before.
Yeah, and
religious
when people
refugees.
are in that, yes, and when people are in that refugee mindset, it's about meeting them where they are, not trying to drag them to where society is. So making some of those points, and also here in New Zealand, we've got a Royal Commission of Inquiry that is just wrapping up. So that report will be out in the next few months, and the Exclusive Brethren are one of the churches that it's looked at.
Oh, wow.
And so examining some of the findings of that Commission of Inquiry, and what that means, and how we can capitalize on that, how we can use that to try and bring about effective change. And in addition to speaking solo. I'll also be on a rainbow panel where we talk about some of the issues that affect rainbow people in the cult space. And while Decult isn't about rainbow issues overall,
We don't
I
with
think
rainbow.
really...
Real quick, it's we don't use that term necessarily. So in USA, so LGBTQ, etc. issues, right? Okay.
Yes. IA plus and all the rest, and it got to a point where I think in New Zealand, well, for me anyway, it was easier to just say rainbow community than list off the whole alphabet.
Yeah.
While acknowledging all those letters of the alphabet. So it's the rainbow community. While Decult isn't necessarily about some of those issues per se, I think it's really important to acknowledge that queer people, rainbow people, are massively disproportionately affected by cults and extreme religious groups. And for me, as someone who realized I was gay as a teenager, I knew that there was absolutely no future for me in the Exclusive Brethren as a gay man. And it adds another layer of complexity and struggle, I suppose, because you're not just coming out, you're coming out as well.
Mm-hmm.
And figuring out what that means. And this is, I think there are two sides to it. One is in the cult space, what support can be given to rainbow people, and in the rainbow community, what specific support can be given to people from cults or religious groups. And that's something that has had a lot of attention in New Zealand in the last few years. A couple of years ago, the government passed legislation banning conversion therapy.
That's incredible. That's a big issue in the US still. There's people still talking about it and initiating new conversion therapy programs, especially in different religious communities, mainstream religious communities even.
Well, it's illegal in New Zealand now.
That's great.
It's good. But the Human Rights Commission here has now been turning its attention to how to practically implement that. And so there have been some really interesting discussions that I have been involved with, involving a lot of survivors from these religious groups in terms of how to support people through those processes. And so I think those are some of the issues that we will explore with the Rainbow panel at Decult.
Incredible. I'm so excited that you are going to be speaking there and you're bringing such a fresh perspective on a little known group like the Exclusive Brethren. And I'm going to share notes during the conference and after, I'm sure. Thanks a lot, Craig, for coming on to the Witness Underground podcast and for supporting Decult. We'll see you in New Zealand. Everyone come down to Decult if you can make it to Christchurch, and if you can't, buy the ticket for the live stream. Pay attention to the Decult conference, and we'll see you there.